This week on Capitol Journal's Week in Review, we're covering the special legislative session on spending the last of federal COVID relief funds. Randy Scott reports on how the legislature decided where to spend that money. The Department of Corrections offers a major pay increase for prison guards to help recruit new employees. Karen Goldsmith has that story. Attorney General Steve Marshall joins us in studio to talk about prisoner release policy, crime, and ESG. Public Health Officer Scott Harris discusses the fentanyl epidemic and what happens when the federal COVID emergency ends. And Scott Latham of the Alabama Bankers Association talks about the recent California bank failures and what it means for the industry. It's all next on Capitol Journal. From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal's Week in Review. The week was a busy one here in the State House as lawmakers wrapped up their special session focused on allocating more than $1 billion in federal American Rescue Plan Act funding. The process for passing the appropriations bill was fairly smooth and bipartisan. Capitol Journal's Randy Scott followed the bill's journey in the House, where members pored over the details.
Lawmakers in the Alabama House waste no time getting a bill to the Senate for how the state plans to use funds provided by the American Rescue Plan Act.
The Senate has passed the ARPA bill out of the Senate. There is a couple of amendments. Chairman Reynolds has talked to me about it. He feels comfortable with it. We certainly are happy to have any conversation.
A few amendments were added on by the Senate addressing infrastructure items, making House members raise new concerns.
For those small cities, and maybe for some of the larger, the person managing finance might not can interpret properly the language that the state and the federal government is giving them. But if we can make a clear statement that if you do not have this 35% matching monies, or whatever matching monies you might need, there are some options for you to continue to do your project.
I represent 6 rural counties, and an amendment that would have been efficient and to those counties that relates to the water runoff, storm, has been taken out, I was told. And then there's a 35% match for rural counties to apply for these funding. Neither county that I represent probably is able to have that matching funding. And I'm concerned about that.
Members work on proposal changes and eventually reach common ground for approving House Bill 1.
Anytime you can do infrastructure, one-time monies like this that literally last a lifetime, I mean, that's a very valuable use of one-time federal dollars. And I think that's going to make our community stronger for many years to come, both on the broadband side and the water infrastructure side.
For Capitol Journal, I'm Randy Scott.
After House passage, the Senate took up the bill this week, finally passing it with a 30-4 vote. The bill was amended, though, so it had to go back to the House for their final approval. That happened on Thursday with a final vote of 96-0 with 6 abstentions. Governor Kay Ivey, who originally called the special session in her State of the State speech, signed the bill into law Thursday afternoon. As I mentioned, the bill was amended in the Senate, once in committee and again on the floor. Senator Chris Elliott of Baldwin County proposed an amendment to specify that half of the $400 million in water and sewer dollars be dedicated to stormwater projects. Separately, $100 million of those funds would be dedicated to local communities who put up a 35% match to get the federal money. Elliott has been critical of how the first round of ARPA water and sewer infrastructure funds were spent, specifically noting that none of the funds went to his fast-growing Baldwin County district. The state chose to prioritize projects by dire needs, with many going to low-income communities in the Black Belt. Elliott said it's only fair that fast-growing communities with infrastructure needs be eligible for at least some of that money.
We've spent a lot of money on water and sewer, or going to here in the near future. $225 million from the first tranche, and then another $400 million or close to it in the second tranche. And what we did in the amendment was simply say that of that $400 million or so, $100 million of it requires a significant match, so that the locals have to have some skin in the game to access that pot of money. So that match is at 35%. And what we're trying to do there is make sure that that money goes as far as it can. We have really critical infrastructure needs. Baldwin County adds 8,000 people a year, every single year, and has for the past decade or so. So you can imagine with that many more people coming, they need that water and sewer infrastructure, as well. And I was frustrated with ADEM's administration, if you will, and how they dispersed the money in the first round of ARPA. And I wanted to make sure that some of this money got to the faster growing areas that saw that physical need, if you will, for increased infrastructure. Not just my area, but around the state. And the way we were able to do that, I think, was pretty reasonable, which was saying those areas that can participate, typically those growing areas, will have this pot of money where they can access those funds, but are required to put that match in.
On the floor, Senator Roger Smitherman of Birmingham successfully added an amendment to allow applicants for these federal funds to amend their applications to correct mistakes, lest they be disqualified for a technical error. He spoke about the need for this provision during the debate.
This is simply to be able to help many of our small towns where they don't have the capacity of staff to know what to do, and it gives them some advice to help them so that they won't lose the opportunity to get the grant. There were some concerns expressed about whether it would increase the necessary cost for these agencies to do it. And that's why that you see the last line where you see it said has the capacity and the expertise available to do it. If you're in a metropolitan area, you probably have someone there who will address that. But our small towns, they cannot afford that.
I would suggest that what we have in your statement, in your amendment, is it's already been done. In fact, that was done in ARPA 1. Whenever there was difficulty or questions, I know that ADEM helped, assisted, guided entities so that applications could be achieved. And I believe and know that they will continue to do that. I hesitate to put that language, which is already occurring, into statute.
As part of the special session, the legislature also passed a bill to repay $59 million to the Alabama Trust Fund. About 10 years ago, during difficult financial times, the legislature and state voters chose to borrow about $400 million from the Alabama Trust Fund to help fill holes in the budget and avoid catastrophic cuts. But they also promised to pay the money back when revenues returned, which they have done year by year. This marks the final payment back to the Alabama Trust Fund. The bill passed unanimously in both chambers, which lawmakers said showed that the state will always pay its debts. Senator Clyde Chambliss of Prattville noted that the budget reforms been put in place recently will prevent the need for such borrowing in the future.
This is not a historic day yet, but this is part of the historic process that's going to go to finally repay the debt that we owe. We as citizens of the state of Alabama, and fortunately we owe it to ourselves, thanks to the forethought of many people that came before us and put in the trust funds so many years ago, and we're blessed as a state to have that, and we should always protect that. This is a step in our acknowledgement that it is a good thing and we want to protect it. So when this bill is passed and when it's signed into law, it will be the culmination of a lot of legislators and executive branch officials that have put time, energy, and effort into the financial changes that allow us to have $60 million. It wasn't that long ago that we didn't have $60 million. We were $250 million in the hole, trying to find money, trying to find ways that we can balance the budget. And through your leadership, other leaders, Senator Orr, who was in the general fund at a time, Senator Tripp Pittman, Representative Klaus, and I know I'm forgetting somebody, our fine folks at LSA, we're in this position.
There was big news on the prison front this week. We'll start with the state's ongoing plans to build 2 mega prisons to replace current old, unsafe facilities. The cost for one of those prisons has increased dramatically. The Alabama Prison Finance Authority voted to increase by $300 million what the state can spend on building a new 4,000 inmate prison in Elmore County. The amount went from $623 million to $975 million. Asked about the increase, Senate General Fund Budget Chairman Greg Albritton pointed to inflation.
That's what inflation does. And it's not, the prisons are a reflection of that. It's a great reflection of that. And I don't mean great and good, I mean great and large. But we're seeing that throughout, everybody's seeing that, from eggs to cars to gas to everything. I don't know how you deal with inflation. That's the plague that we have upon us. That's been given to us by the feds. That's the greatest gift, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, it's harmful. It's hurting us. It's eating away at our resources. We've got to deal with it.
The Alabama Department of Corrections this week announced a hefty pay raise for prison guards. It's an effort to recruit more guards and other personnel to fill a dire shortage. Karen Goldsmith has that story.
It's been well documented that federal judge Myron Thompson has mandated Alabama's Department of Corrections to hire more corrections officers. Corrections Commissioner John Hamm says they have funding for 688 more, but labor shortages, the dangerous work conditions, and better pay and benefits offered by local law enforcement have made meeting that requirement difficult.
We don't really compete with the other state correctional departments. We compete with, like you said, the city police departments and the county sheriff's offices.
In this conversation and at a recent budget hearing, Hamm shared he sees light at the end of this dark tunnel.
We had about 8 quarters of decline in staffing. We were losing more people than we were bringing in. Last quarter, that number leveled off. That doesn't sound like a whole lot, but that is a huge victory for us.
And a few days after this briefing, the department announced pay increases for all corrections officers.
This is an enticement, and we feel like it will increase our numbers because all these other little things we're doing, it was not moving the needle, so this is the next step.
The starting annual salary for corrections officer trainees at the maximum security facilities is now $55,855. At the medium security facilities, it's $53,244, and at the work release community work centers, it's $50,712. There's also a 27% available increase after 18 months. The lowest starting annual pay used to be $33,381. And DOC support staff members who work at the medium and maximum security prisons will also be paid more. The commissioner says the total cost for the pay escalations is $13 million.
It is a great opportunity for someone wanting to get into public service and public safety work, because our little slogan now is, earn more, grow more, expect more. It is a very competitive wage now. The career progression, up to the warden is outstanding right now. Most people, when they get in a career, they kind of want to go up the ladder a little bit, and at Department of Corrections, that is a great opportunity right now.
For more information, go to doc.state.al.us. For Capitol Journal, I'm Karen Goldsmith.
Alabama won big at the Academy Awards earlier this week. Birmingham native Daniel Scheinert took home the Oscar for Best Directing alongside his creative partner, and Paul Rogers, also from Birmingham, won the Oscar for Best Editing, all for the film Everything Everywhere All at Once. And we have to especially brag on Paul Rogers because he previously worked here at Alabama Public Television as a documentary editor. How about that? Congrats, fellas. We'll be right back with tonight's guests.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts. Keep up with what's happening with Capital Journal.
Joining me next is Attorney General Steve Marshall. Mr. Marshall, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, good to be here.
Lots of topics to talk about, as we were just kind of sharing before we went live. I wanted to have you on to talk about this prisoner release situation. This is a little more than a month ago, where the situation emerged from a law that was passed in 2021, that the effect of which was hundreds, almost 500, I think. Prisoners got out of prison before their end of sentence with ankle monitors, and the reason behind this was saying that, well, if we monitor them, maybe they'll be less likely to recommit crimes and end up back in jail. You had some vocal opposition to this. Walk me through your argument.
Yeah, and this is not new. I mean, this bill was proposed back in 2019 and 2020 by Senator Ward when he was there, and then obviously was placed in the call by the governor in 21 for passage. And we've been vocal in our opposition from the beginning, and it's really sort of surrounding a couple different areas. Number one, this was going to make the law that passed in 2015 retroactive, which means we're going to capture significant numbers coming out compared to the trickle, if you will, before. And more principally is the fact that it was going to capture disproportionately violent offenders, because right now our prison system is heavily weighted over 80% of individuals being violent offenders. And the question was, why do we want to release them early as opposed to more of a federal model where supervision, which is good, by the way, I don't have any problem with the concept of supervision, but the question is where that supervision occurs. Under this bill that passed, it was shortening the time for them to come out to go to supervision, as opposed to a federal model, which is you serve your sentence and you come out to supervision. So that was kind of the first question. And then second is simply the capacity that we have to absorb these numbers into the system. That you referenced 500. It was a little over 400 just in the month of January, but we still have kind of from February through July anywhere between 1,000 and 1,200 coming out, and that is significantly more than we've ever seen. And in many respects, when we look at this law and when we discuss it, it's really driven by rhetoric as opposed to facts, because number one, Alabama's never had to supervise violent offenders in a way that we're doing it. And there's national data that talk about what are the ratios for a violent offender per supervising officer and what does that truly look like. And if you look at Alabama's numbers, for example, last fiscal year to this fiscal year, it was almost a 22% reduction in the number of people doing supervision. And so we have less individuals able to do supervision with many more that were coming out. And then if you just looked at, say, what was coming to Birmingham or Mobile, where we've seen significant rises in violent crime in recent history, there were multiple individuals, disproportionate numbers, that had committed murders, robberies, or rapes. And those were being inserted into our system. And while I can respect the fact that an ankle monitor can be used in supervision, number one, the law itself doesn't say they're going to be under an ankle monitor for the entire time. In fact, we saw an example where somebody that was released for murder had an ankle monitor for 2 days. Now, I understand maybe that has changed as a matter of policy, but an ankle monitor doesn't keep you from committing a crime. It just simply tells you where somebody is, maybe when they commit a new crime. And so the idea behind supervision and what we're doing, to me, needs to be within the narrative, number one, of what's our capacity to supervise, and number two, what does the data tell us about what's appropriate to do and how do we keep communities safe? Because here's the simple reality for me. I know if they're in prison, I know what they're doing and where they are. When they're released into community, we don't always know that. And also understand in Alabama right now, over 20,000 individuals are subject to supervision. But for the first time as a result of this bill, many of those are now including violent offenders, and we've never done that before.
So, if I hear you correctly, does that mean changing maybe the end of sentence policies in laws in Alabama? Because that's what I keep hearing from Chairman Hill and Cam Ward is that, look, once they're end of sentence, we don't see them anymore. So maybe the federal model you're talking about would require a change to law to saying, okay, just when you complete your sentence, then you are still subject to monitoring maybe for those violent offenders. Is that kind of what you're advocating?
It is. And in fact, I would love to see us actually just examine soup to nuts where we are with criminal justice. Because here's what people lose, and that's the overlay of these one-off bills and what it ultimately means for somebody's sentence. For example, good time credit comes into play as it relates to release. And obviously that's a little bit of a discussion going on right now.
Sure.
So a 15-year sentence, when somebody maxes out good time credit, is really only about 4 years and 7 months. But then when you add on mandatory supervised release for that 15-year sentence that was 4 years and 7 months, actually gets reduced down to 3 years and 7 months. And you got to ask, if somebody's in there for manslaughter, somebody that's taken the life of somebody else through their criminal activity, is 3 years and 7 months truly what we believe somebody ought to serve behind bars? And I think if you ask the most people that I see, they're going to tell you no, that that's really not an appropriate sentence. And so what I would love us to be able to look at is, what should sentencing be in Alabama? What does a sentence actually mean when that judge says to an individual, you're going to serve X number of years? And then how do we then allow for public safety to be enhanced, consistent with this idea before, supervision occurring, but occurring once somebody has paid their debt back to society through the service of that sentence. And I truly think that as we continue to do kind of these isolated, I use that educational incentive time, for example, from a couple years ago, which we pushed back on giving that to those that are subject to rape or robbery, that they shouldn't be able to take some academic credit and reduce the time that they have before they come up for parole, is let's make sure that we're looking at the entire spectrum of criminal justice and how do we do sentencing well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I look forward to that.
Yeah.
Panel discussion. That would be a very deep subject. Moving on, I want to talk about gang violence. You sent out this op-ed the other day talking about gang violence in Alabama and how maybe our statutes aren't up to date to maybe give us the tools to deal with gang violence. Walk me through what you want to see happen.
Yeah. Well, number one is sort of the reason why, and that is, we see the rise in violence in some of our major cities as well as even in our rural areas. When I talk to mayors, they talk about gang activity in their communities. I saw Randall Woodfin was very public in a social media post, for example, telling the gang members to stand down because it was driving some of the violent activity in their community. And,
wow, a public plea to say.
Yeah, very much so back in September. And if we have that acknowledgement that that's going on, and law enforcement knows that's going on, then why don't we give the tool to prosecutors and to law enforcement to deal with that activity? And so what we're proposing is really something that Alabama would become in line with other states, and that is, number one, to define a gang. And by the way, we're not just talking about kind of Bloods, Crips, MS-13, but it's really 3 or more people coming together for bad reasons, to do bad things.
I was going to ask you to kind of explain the nature of this, because many of us don't really understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, it's a group of people coming together for corporate criminal activity, to further the interest of the gang, the influence of the gang, the power of the gang, that they're engaging in violent acts or property crimes against their community. And so we define what a gang member is and give that understanding of how the court can evaluate whether you're in a gang or whether you're not. And then if you're a gang member engaged in gang activity resulting in crime, then we ought to enhance that punishment to create that deterrent effect for those that want to engage in this behavior, so that we're raising a Class C to a Class B, a Class B to a Class A felony. And then with that is the gun violence that is occurring with gang activity. Let's create mandatory minimums, very similar to what was in the federal system, that if you're going to engage in gang activity with a crime and you got a gun, we're going to make sure you serve a minimum amount of time. If you brandish that gun, raise that minimum up a little bit more. And then if you actually fire that weapon in the course of gang activity, that we create a higher offense. The idea being, we want to create that disincentive for gangs to engage in this type of behavior. Because the other thing that I'm hearing from law enforcement, I hear from public officials, is kind of these revenge crimes. The gang feels disrespected, or one of their gang members themselves has been harmed, and they go back for retribution. You know, if we can somehow or another create disincentive for individuals to commit those offenses, then we're going to have a dramatic impact on our streets. Alabama doesn't have that tool currently. This is a way to be able to give prosecutors and law enforcement an opportunity to combat this problem.
Well, you think we'll see legislation soon?
Yeah, we're going to see that dropped, and I think we're going to have significant support.
Okay. Well, you know, that kind of brings me to the issue of crime more generally, kind of zooming out a bit. Stephen Boyd wrote this column for Alabama Daily News the other day. I think you said you read it. It kind of went the gamut of the crime issue in terms of what the data says. Data can be tough because the FBI tends to change the way it reports and everything, but that, you know, maybe overall crime has been down lately, but then violent crime has been increasing. But this sort of perception versus reality, right? It doesn't, just because the data says one thing, it just kind of feels less safe out there. It feels like it's more violent, to the point where, you know, Congress overturns these penalty decreases that the D.C. City Council passed. That's significant. I mean, it's Democratic Senate, Democratic President. So I wondered if you could just kind of comment on that in terms of, you know, being an Attorney General, maybe also speaking for prosecutors in this world where, yeah, it does feel sometimes more violent, but maybe the data isn't exactly reflecting that.
Well, number one, I can tell you it's the principal issue that people stop and talk to me about. You know, when I'm in the grocery store, when I'm out and about this state, that's the one thing they ask about, is what are we doing to combat criminal activity? So that's real, and that's not driven by some political narrative. That's based on what their perception is for their own communities. And look, we need to look no further than Birmingham, for example, with the most recent year that we had with a record number of homicides. And not only that, with Birmingham and compared historically with a population that's decreased, right? It's the same population that they had 10 years ago. And in even some respects, homicide data is misleading because we got great doctors out there that saves lives when somebody's shot. And so we got to broaden our net as our perception of what violence looks like. It's not just those who's lost their lives, but who's been harmed as a result of violent activity. And those numbers aren't decreasing. You know, we saw a very significant downward trend from the 80s, from the heyday of crack cocaine, and we made progress in this country, but yet it began the uptick really kind of coincided about when Jeff Sessions became our Attorney General during the beginning of the Trump administration, where their aggressive actions began to be taken to try to curb what was a trend going in the wrong direction. The other thing, and this is one thing I probably disagree with a little bit with what Stephen wrote, is crime data lags behind a little bit, particularly our assessment of property crimes and nonviolent offenses. And so when you're looking at crime data out there, you're really looking at a snapshot roughly 18 months ago. And if folks remember, there was this little thing called COVID, right? When we dealt with that, we knew the lockdowns that took place.
Yeah, we're all at home.
Yeah, COVID itself was responsible for a reduction in property crimes all across the country because simply people weren't out in the same way that they were before. But what I can tell you is there's a tangible perception of the people of the state, and I think in this nation, that believe that we've got to do something about our crime problem. And it's why when I'm having these discussions around the very topics that we've talked about here, we can't retreat from things that we know have worked or from giving the tools to prosecutors and law enforcement to be able to combat this issue.
Well, and certainly not, I mean, obviously they're talking about, you know, reducing penalties for carjackings, things like that. It's certainly, I think there's perception out there that they don't want to retreat from some of these, you know, penalties and issues like that.
And I would also just, you know, we saw that lax policies of prosecutors around the country have had an impact on property crime. Think about San Francisco. Think about some of the stories we've heard from Chicago and New York, where now we've had recalling of prosecutors. We've had prosecutors that didn't get reelected under this, they were sort of elected in to reform the system. Well, that reform ignored prosecuting even minor level offenses that add up. And I'm a big believer in sort of that broken windows theory that New York used so successfully to reduce crime many years ago, that I think people are now seeing there's value in making sure that we hold people accountable and that we do that in a very significant way.
Mm-hmm. Well, while I've got you, I really wanted to hit on this subject of ESG. It stands for Environment, Social, and Governance. Basically, companies choosing to focus on these issues, climate change, for example, or social justice, or what have you, kind of political ideologies, with the idea that, when they do that, it will appeal to their customers or investors. But it's kind of taken a life of its own, and even to the public retirement realm. And I know you've injected into that issue. Could you sort of talk about your involvement in ESG and your opposition to it?
Yeah, it's been very much an issue for me for a while, and partly is the work that I do in leading the National Republican Attorney Generals Association. It's been kind of a multi-pronged attack. But we saw that very tangibly here in Alabama when the most recent bond issue to be able to build these new prisons, which are very important for us to be able to do as a state. We weren't able to acquire all of the financing that we thought we should have, which the state clearly had a credit rating to get, because those on the left pushed against Alabama's effort under this guise of over-incarceration or somehow or another that we weren't doing criminal justice right. So that part of ESG is really about access to the market for financing. And we see that on multiple areas, but for us in Alabama, it was a very much an adverse response to what should have been, based on traditional financing principles, a very easy bond issue for us to be able to execute. And so we see it on multiple layers. I'm really proud of young Boozer for saying we're going to pull Alabama's assets out of BlackRock. BlackRock, who's advancing policies that don't necessarily lend themselves well to Alabama's business and economic interests. But our work, number one, has been around protecting hardworking Alabamians that got their money in IRAs and investment accounts. And we have a Biden administration that wants to give protection to investment advisors to invest in ESG investments when they may not have the best return coming back. Because it's really a battle of the left to inject issues and create change that they can't get in the ballot box, particularly in a state like Alabama. And so my effort in my work is to make sure that we preserve this concept of what a fiduciary is. Fiduciary designed to make sure that they advance the financial interest of whom they represent. And then second is that we don't allow for these subjective criteria to be applied to cities and counties with regard to their own credit rating, or the efforts of credit rating agencies to impose certain requirements on cities and counties that aren't a part of Alabama law. And then beyond that, at the national level, is really this antitrust work that we're attempting to investigate to see whether or not there's a combining of these entities that control significant trillions of dollars of assets to impose an agenda that otherwise is inconsistent with the law. So I think it's an area that you continue to hear a lot more about, and you'll absolutely see me leading on across the state.
So I hear you. The one place I'm not really sure about is, like, yes, if it involves government, if there's any kind of government pressure and all that kind of stuff, it shouldn't be involved. But if I have a company and I just want to be involved in ESG and I want to be socially woke or whatever, that's my right as a company,
Absolutely
right?
Is.
So where are the limits of what you or other attorneys general or the state can do in advancing what you want and limiting some of this stuff, but not encroaching on private rights?
Yeah, and I think the market ought to work. And the question for us is exactly what you said. If you're a private investor, you can invest in all the ESG investments you want. That's your desire. If you believe that's appropriate, I don't think you're going to get as much return for your money. But that, again, that's your call. But the issue becomes, though, and I'll use that safe harbor rule that I was describing earlier.
This is Labor Department?
Labor Department, yeah. So safe harbor rule basically insulates somebody from liability. So that if you're just an average Alabamian that's trusting that investment firm to invest your money, your desire is to make sure that you've got the most return for you at the time of your retirement. The question, though, is if that investment advisor has a different agenda, say climate change, for example, and they want to only invest in ESG investments that advance their version of what climate change should be, because clearly that doesn't occur in consultation with the individual investor, then that shouldn't be allowed, because that investment advisor should be designed there solely to maximize the return for those people they represent, not to create somehow another societal change that they think would be good for the greater good. And so our goal and our mission there is to make sure that, number one, individual investors have full disclosure of what's going on.
That's fair.
But then second, that we make sure that there's not some government mandate that occurs to create this change that otherwise is inconsistent with the return, the fiduciary obligation directly to that investor. I think you're going to hear sort of this concept fleshed out in lots of ways and in lots of areas. And I do think some of the investigations that we're operating on right now will do a good job of being able to illustrate the importance of this issue for the people of our state.
Well, we're actually going to talk with Scott Latham of the Banking Association about Silicon Valley Bank and some of those issues, but I won't press you on that.
Exhibit A probably of the discussion.
We're out of time. We're actually over time, but I really appreciate you coming on the show. Attorney General Steve Marshall.
Appreciate it.
We'll be right back.
You're watching Alabama Public Television.
Joining me next is Dr. Scott Harris, Public Health Officer for the state of Alabama. Dr. Harris, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Todd. Good to see you.
You know, we used to do this every week.
Yeah.
I think it's actually maybe a good thing that
Yeah,
we don't have to anymore.
I think everyone's happy not to see me. That's okay with me. So.
Well, and we'll get to some COVID stuff in a minute, but I wanted to have you on because the Department of Public Health is a part of this program, movement, talking about fentanyl and getting out the word about the dangers of fentanyl. And it's called Odds Are, meaning that, you know, the odds are that this drug that you've acquired from the black market is probably laced with fentanyl, which is just a scary concept. Can you talk about this issue in general and why public health decided to get involved?
Sure. So the Odds Are is a campaign that's done by several groups. The Medical Association of the state of Alabama convened a group of people that included us, but also some other medical societies, associations. The hospital associations played a big role, and mental health as well, Department of Mental Health as well. What we want people in the public to be aware of is just how much fentanyl there is. You know, it's an incredibly dangerous drug. It's dangerous and deadly in very tiny qualities and quantities, and yet we're seeing more and more of it. It is all over the place. You know, just a few grains of fentanyl can be fatal in certain situations. You know, it's you know, maybe 50 times more potent than heroin, maybe 100 times more potent than morphine, and more it's starting to show up in places you just wouldn't expect it. You know, so people buy a pill off the internet, you know, that they think is a stimulant to keep them awake, or they think it's, you know, some other thing to alter their consciousness, and, you know, maybe they've had experience with it before or maybe not, but these things turn out to be laced with fentanyl in a lot of cases, and it's really resulted in some terrible outcomes.
Overdoses, deaths.
Overdoses and deaths, exactly. You know, since 2018, we've had about a 3,000% increase in emergency room visits related to fentanyl, and a several hundredfold, 200 to 300-fold increase in deaths. So those numbers are increasing, and it's not just in Alabama, it's all over the country. But more and more we're seeing, you know, drug dealers and illicit drug manufacturers adding this stuff. And you know, there's no quality control when you're, you know, making illegal drugs in your basement. You know, they put some of this in there because they think it'll make people more easily addicted, or it may give them a little bit more buzz, you know, for their quantity that they're using and so on. But obviously they don't care about people's safety, and people are dying, and typically young people that are experimenting with these things, or people that are using drugs for the first time or early on in their life, and it's really been a tragic situation.
Yeah, we had this whole episode dedicated to the issue of prevention and treatment and all that for opioids, and I remember some of the doctors talking about, and law enforcement talking about, it's like if a student out there is trying to get an Adderall pill off the internet, or Xanax, these are popular drugs amongst, you know, teenagers and people in their 20s. It could be laced with fentanyl, and just one pill could be it.
That's exactly right. You know, now these prescription drugs that you mentioned are, you know, well-known prescription drugs, but people manufacture things to look exactly like them.
Right. Yeah. They even make it look.
They actually make it in the manufacturing process to be a counterfeit version, so that you can fool people into thinking it's the real drug. And they just put in there whatever they want to put in there that'll have some kind of effect. And unfortunately, many times it's fentanyl.
Switching gears, I want to talk about COVID, and that, you know, I have that Time Hop app on my phone where it shows you what was happening 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and so right around now was the time back in 2020 when we're starting the COVID, the effects of it, and it became really real. So we're, flash forward. It's been 3 years. It's my understanding that you were saying that the public health emergency is about to expire, the federal one, and what happens when that occurs?
Yeah, that's right. So it has been 3 years ago this week that we had our first case in Alabama, as you know, and we don't want to even have to relive all those times. But
yeah.
But the federal public health emergency has been in place since right before we actually had our first case here in Alabama. And what that has allowed over time is a lot of flexibility in certain types of rules. It's allowed the federal government to go out and buy things like vaccines and monoclonal antibodies and medications that can be given away for free to the public who needs them. It allows us a lot of flexibility in hiring and in a lot of the things that we do. So that's going to expire about the second week of May, the federal public health emergency. But COVID's not going to be completely gone, of course. And so what that means effectively is that all those things that people have been able to access for free for the last 3 years are going to go to the commercial marketplace. So if you want to get a vaccine, you would do it like any other vaccine. You go to a doctor's office or a clinic or a pharmacy and pay your copay and get your vaccine. If you get COVID, you need to go get a prescription and go to the drugstore and get that prescription filled. Or what we're concerned a lot about are at-home tests. Right now you can get free at-home testing available through the federal government, or insurance companies are required to pay for those at the moment. But when the federal public health emergency goes away, you're not likely to be able to get free at-home tests anymore. At least most people won't have access to that. So, we don't know how that's going to play out, but, if there's less availability of testing, there's going to be less testing. So we're going to have a lot less information about what's going on with COVID.
Yeah. Well, I was telling you, I saw a commercial for, is it Paxlovid?
Paxlovid is
Paxlovid,
yes,
yeah.
right.
I was watching the tournament last night, and a commercial for a COVID medication. It was just like, wow, okay, this is going commercial. That's really interesting. Well, now that we are, we can say we're through the pandemic. This has been your focus, intense focus at the Department of Public Health for a long time. What happens post-COVID? What do y'all, do you get to work on things maybe that were having to be shelved before?
Yeah, nobody knows that we do other things, I guess.
Right. You've
right.
been in the public eye so long for this, and so maybe it'd be good to explain the other roles of public health.
Yeah, so we are involved in a lot of different things. We're the silent guardians of public health, in that nobody really knows what we do unless something goes wrong, or unless they really need us, I guess. But we're a very large provider for many different services in the community, and especially for people that have nowhere else to go. We do a lot of childhood vaccinations. We do a lot of family planning and birth control services for low-income people, for low-income women, and even men, for that matter. We investigate infections like STDs or tuberculosis or those types of things. So we continued to do those through the pandemic, but obviously our attention was focused elsewhere. We know that kids in general didn't get vaccinated as much, even for their normal routine vaccinations. When they weren't in school in person, for example, a lot of kids missed a lot of shots. We know a lot of people just didn't get their routine medical screening care, cancer screening type things, for example, because maybe their primary care physician just wasn't, seeing a lot of those people in the office, or things just got disrupted. So, mammogram numbers went way down, pap smear numbers went way down. And I think we really worry about that. Again, if you stop screening for cancer, for 2 or 3 years, you're probably going to see more cancer. And so we expect that those are things that we're going to see, and Alabama's going to have to deal with. So we're working very hard to try to get back to doing those things that we normally do.
Mm-hmm. It's the legislative session. We're getting into budgets next week. Were there any specific budget requests that your department made to the legislature?
Not very much. We essentially asked for level funding, except for a small appropriation for our county health department environmental health programs. We asked for a total of like $3 million, which is not a huge ask in the grand scope of the budget, I guess. But what that money will do will allow us to put environmentalists in our health department who are responsible for things like restaurant inspections, for doing a septic tank permitting. They investigate animal bites. They deal with solid waste issues. In some cases, in some counties they are involved with mosquito spraying and vector control. There are a lot of things that our environmentalists do in the county health department, and we've had a lot of attrition in that department over the years, and so we're looking to try to get those people back to normal strength.
It's those things that you just kind of count on to work. behind the scenes that we don't think about a whole lot, but you just sort of depend on it.
Yeah, that's right. When you go to eat in a restaurant, you don't usually think, am I going to get sick here or not? I have to decide whether it's safe to eat here. You just assume it's going to be safe. And our environmentalists are the ones looking into that and making sure that's the case. And they've continued to do that through COVID, although they've been spread really thin. We've used them in a lot of other capacities as well. So we're looking forward to getting back to doing the normal public health things that we've always done.
Good. Well, we're out of time, but I want to have you back for more non-COVID, non-pandemic conversations. Dr. Scott Harris, thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Todd.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page.
Joining me next is Scott Latham, President and CEO of the Alabama Bankers Association. Scott, thanks for coming on the show.
Todd, thank you, and congratulations on anchoring such an outstanding show.
Well, thanks.
Glad to see you on it.
It's been a little over a year. It's been fun.
Yes, sir.
We like to stay topical on this show, and in the news for the last week or so has been this bank situation. Silicon Valley Bank is the big example of it. There was kind of a run on it, and the federal government stepping in, the Fed, I guess, stepping in. There have been a couple other of these banks fail. I wanted to have you on to maybe help explain to viewers from an industry perspective how something like this happens.
Todd, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you. That's a great question. It's certainly been on the minds of lots of people this past week. Days prior to the bank collapsing, the FDIC chairman, Marty Gruenberg, was giving an ongoing assessment of the nation's banks, and rightly so, described them as safe, highly liquid, and in very good shape. What happened in California has been called an idiosyncratic event, a very unique event. I didn't know anything about the Silicon Valley Bank, and apparently a lot of other people didn't. It is a bank that was based certainly in California. The large majority of its business and its customers in the Silicon Valley or in that business were technology-based businesses. So in kind of an Alabama language, they had a lot of eggs in one basket. Lots of their deposit customers, lots of their loans were all really in one industry. That industry came under pressure. The bank itself, because of a lack of appropriate management of interest rate risk when rates rose during the inflation, and certainly an inappropriate governance, I suppose, of its deposit concentration. That particular bank found itself needing to raise some money. It spooked investors largely through social media, and an old-fashioned run on the bank occurred. And that's really how we wound up where we did late last Friday.
I'm thinking of It's a Wonderful Life.
Yes,
like,
sir.
Run on banks, and that's sort of my familiarity. But a run on a bank now is really like a stock option sort of thing sometimes, isn't it?
Well, it's almost unheard of. A run on a bank, particularly with technology and the amount of regulation that we have, and certainly the just the way banks operate now. It's something I never thought we'd see, and apparently a lot of people either.
Well, that's out in California, so maybe there's some distance here to have us some peace of mind. But can you tell people, can we be assured of banks in Alabama, of their solvency? Should people feel comfortable and safe?
Yes, sir. People should feel comfortable and safe. And I'll go so far as to say 99% of the banks in this country are highly capitalized and very safe banks. Alabama banks are no exception to that. If you compare the Silicon Valley Bank, or Signature Bank for that matter, to most of the rest of the banks in the country, and certainly Alabama banks, about the only thing similar is bank in the name. Our banks are diversified, whether a small community bank in a very rural area of the state or a large urban bank. Our banks have appropriate distribution of the concentration of deposits, of loan customers, various segments of business that they do, which by and large is one of the things you really want in your bank. So Alabama banks are very, very highly capitalized. Our industry, no surprise, is highly regulated. And while people certainly like to talk about the negatives of regulation, most of our bankers will tell you they appreciate and value good and appropriate levels of regulation. Mm-hmm. So whether a federally regulated bank by the FDIC or the Federal Reserve, or under Treasury for national banks, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, or the Alabama Banking Department for state chartered banks, banks in Alabama are regulated, they are strong, they are safe. And I'll make this point too. I'm very proud of not only the management teams in our banks across the state, but also our boards of directors. The Alabama Bankers Association has the largest bank director training event in the nation. We partner with the FDIC. We've done it for years. And our banks bring directors in from all across the state to make sure that they're well versed in their responsibilities. I don't know one director at Silicon Valley Bank, but some things I've read and heard have indicated that most of those directors didn't really have all the experience they needed to be governing a bank.
Let's talk about that regulation, because people are blaming regulation, some are blaming the law, and y'all were involved in this effort to reform banking regulations back in, was it 2017, 2018
That's right.
range?
That's right.
It was a big deal. It was a bipartisan bill, kind of removing a lot of red tape and regulation unnecessary. And that threshold got moved to $250 billion in assets for extra regulation, which you've got to be a pretty giant bank for that to. And Silicon Valley's just below that, right?
That's right.
So there's talk of sort of walking some of those reforms back, just out of maybe reaction to news. You got to do something. Government's got to do something, right?
Right.
Are you concerned? What are you hearing from your colleagues around the country about whether Congress might take a look at that law?
Certainly, as you pointed out, in a time of crisis or an unanticipated event, folks always raise their hand quickly and say, we've got to change this, we've got to change that. The ink really isn't dry on this deal yet. And so my colleagues around the country and I, who have been on more Zoom calls this week than you could imagine, believe and have indicated that we first want the dust to settle to see exactly what went wrong here. Much about the regulation that is in place that you described is working and has worked. And so we want to make sure that the response that follows the failure of the bank in California and in New York are responses that are appropriate for what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've also, I've read a lot about this. I'm just kind of fascinated about this issue. But there was some concern, or there was some talk of, what this leads to. Does this lead to more giant banks kind of buying up smaller banks, even regional banks? You come from the community bank,
absolutely,
background. Is there concern out there that, because I don't think we want a country where 4 or 5 banks own the entire industry. People like their hometown banks. So is there any concern in the industry right now about where this leads just from a practical standpoint?
You can jump on any of the 24-hour news cycles and hear some talking heads indicating we should do this or we shouldn't do that. This country was founded on local communities and hard work and Main Street. And we have banks across this country in crossroads, in rural areas, and in some cases that may be the only thing standing in an area that perhaps 50 years ago was very vibrant. Mm-hmm. I don't see for a minute a concern about us moving in the direction of 4 or 5 or 6 banks in our lifetime at all. The banks in Alabama, and we have large banks and small banks. All of those banks have a place and a role. All are very successful and appreciated within the communities that they serve. And I think what we have to remember is that what works for one may not work as well for the other. And so the diversity that we have in the size of the banks in the state and their ability to respond to the needs of their customers wherever they're doing business is really what's important. We have been in very close touch with our banks this week and have monitored closely the conversations that they're having with customers. And I was telling you on the way to the studio, I am super pleased that each of the banks that I have talked with have said, you know what, it's been good. Our customers come in, and there have been questions, as there should be, if people are concerned. But we've been able to reassure them, and none of the banks have reported significant inflows or outflows of deposits or business. So we're thankful for that. I think that has a lot to do with where we are, but I can say for every state that I've been in contact with, and that's been 49 or really all 50 states this week, most communities are reporting that same thing.
Well, that is reassuring to me, and I'm sure to a lot of our audience. So thank you for coming in and sharing this with us. Scott Latham of the Alabama Bankers Association. Thanks
Thank
again.
you so much.
We'll be right back.
At 2 p.m. on February 16, 1968, the very first 911 call was made in Haleyville, Alabama. The call was made by State Representative Rankin Veit from Haleyville Mayor James Witt's office and was answered by U.S. Representative Tom Bevel at the Haleyville Police Station on a bright red telephone that was given to the city by the Alabama Telephone Company. Haleyville still celebrates their part in 911 history with an annual festival.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. We'll be back Monday night at 10:30 with regular coverage of the Alabama legislature right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capitol Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.